This is the Fifth Estate Winning Headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we take a look at the headlines that you may have missed this morning. We also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 15th of September 2021, and I am AX.
I am DK.
I am CS. In case you missed them, in the headlines, Daily Nation, Magoha, why the CBC is here to stay. In the Standard, pain as fuel prices hit an all-time high.
Yeah.
In the Star, search for Raila RUTO running mate hots up. And in the People Daily, RUTO's allies feel heat of BBI collapse. Quite an array of headlines.
Indeed.
DK, what's your submission for us today?
My thoughts today are inspired by the use of the word collapse in the People Daily today. And it got me thinking, about a week ago, a building that was under construction in Kenol area started crumbling. This was after it had just gotten ready for painting. But before it came down completely, it had tilted to one side, and people actually started calling it the Leaning Tower of Kenol. However, what was more interesting to me is the videos that people took when the building eventually was coming down. In a tone that doesn't sound too scared or too surprised, one of them can be heard saying, "Kuisha maneno." And maybe we should just play the video for our viewers to know what you're talking about.
Maneno. No video
Now, in my opinion, the state of the hustler nation today, as we are speaking, is that of the leaning tower of a leaning tower that will soon collapse. Why am I saying this? In architecture, when erecting pillars, engineers use a type of metal known as B16. If you use strong and genuine B16, your building will hold. If you don't, then kaboom, your building will come down. And in making of slabs, engineers use metals known as B10. Again, genuine quality of B10 ensures safety. Following this, here are the two reasons as to why I believe the hustler nation, as engineered by William RUTO today, is collapsing.
Kuisha maneno.
Kuisha maneno. Reason number one, William RUTO has used Gema MPs as his B16 to erect pillars of the hustler nation. At Fort Hall College, we have always warned him that Gema MPs cannot be bought. They can only be rented. Just when RUTO was ready to start painting his building in his UDA colors, the MPs are saying they don't want to be in UDA. They want to bring their own parties into the hustler nation. Because they are playing more than one game, and that's why probably they're operating from Sabina Joy, they are behaving suboptimally, and the house of William RUTO is shaking from the pillars just because of the MPs that he has used. Reason number two, the DP has used Gema or Gema masses as his support base. This, in my opinion, equates to using Kikuyus as his B10 to create his political slab. And that's not enough. After the pillars started shaking, now he is telling us that he will go straight to the masses and form direct alliance with them. Now, this will not be a mistake. It will be a disaster. Let me explain. Referring to the dictator's handbook, political landscape is layered in three. One, the essential. These are the owners of things, the Jimmy Wanjigis, the whoever who own things. Without their support, you cannot win an election, and William RUTO doesn't have them. from Gema. Number 2 are the influentials. These are the people who sit in a boardroom or wherever they sit and they decide who they want to lead them. These people carry immense influence. And number 3 are the interchangeables, or the masses that he wants to form an alliance with. These ones are the voters, any eligible voter. They swing like a pendulum and making, when they swing like a pendulum like this, and then that makes them very, very unreliable. And that's why they are called interchangeables. And therefore, banking your political capital with the Gema masses will only make your leaning tower of the hustler nation collapse. And the Kikuyus will take videos of it and say,
Kuisha maneno. An absolutely excellent submission, DK. But allow me to change the tone just a little bit, to be a little bit more inspirational today. So we have often been told that if at first you don't succeed, try again. And that where there is a will, there is a way. Especially when what is at stake is the political stability of the republic. Now, it is common knowledge that the state of our nation fractures every 5 years. It is as sure as the sun rising in the morning. But what can you do when the solution you have posed is rejected not once, but twice? The answer is very simple. You try again. And that is exactly what Daragwa lawmaker Jeremiah Kioni and the Constitutional Implementation Oversight Committee, or CIOC, are doing. The CIOC has been meeting in Mombasa to discuss proposals to expand the executive, adding 5 new positions, yes, 5, a new deputy president, a prime minister, and 2 deputy prime ministers. The proposal, to some extent, mirrors the 2008 Grand Coalition Arrangement and the BBI bill. And that is what I will be unpacking today. The primary purpose of the proposals is to dilute the office of the deputy president. Kioni hopes that in doing so, people will stop fighting over the position. And these are fights that go beyond the political and to the existential, threatening the lives of millions of Kenyans and the political stability of the republic, simply because there are not enough seats at the table. Thus, by adding 5 new seats, the CIOC hopes to engender political stabilization by changing the conditions of competition. To explain why this will work, I turn to Italian political scientist Stefano Bartolini. According to Bartolini, there are 4 axes of political competition: contestability, availability, decidability, and vulnerability. Of the 4, only one interests us: contestability. Contestability refers to the extent to which political parties can contest elections in an election. Often this has to do with party registration procedures and a party's capacity to run elections campaigns. But in this instance, it refers to the balance between the number of available positions and the number of available candidates. If there is 1 position and 10 candidates, the fights that will rock this nation are more likely, as is the political instability that will follow. If, however, there are 5 positions and 10 candidates, fighting is less likely. Interest can be catered to, and political stability has a fighting chance.
Thank you for that submission. And it's not just the parliamentarians who are continuing in this fight. The president recently told us that BBI did not stop with the courts of law, something that he will continue even after he leaves office. And I was very encouraged by that.
They say you can change the rhythm, but you cannot stop the music.
Exactly.
Radio is still on.
So I would like to submit as follows. Aristotle, the ancient Greek polymath and political scientist, theorized about what he called zoon politikon in his book Nicomachean Ethics. He asserted that human beings are by nature political animals, partly because we are social beings. Nature, which does nothing in vain, has equipped us with speech which enables us to communicate moral concepts such as justice and fairness, which are building blocks for community, and in turn the city-state, or in our case, the nation-state. Even on a global scale, we now frequently speak of the community of nations. At the risk of being overly reductionist, the community exists for the sake of the individual, and the individual advances the interest of the community for his sake. One way of understanding it is the South African concept popularized by Archbishop Desmond Tutu when he spoke of Ubuntu, which means I am because we are.
Yeah.
Aristotle wrote that the complete community formed from several villages is a city-state. It comes to be for the sake of life and exists for the sake of good life. He goes on to write that everyone naturally has the impulse for such a political community. That is, one which comes to be for the sake of life and exists for the sake of good life. What is therefore achieved by this, at least in one overarching sense, is people, households, communities coming together as a nation state in a pattern of consensual leadership for common goals and collective action. For Kenya, the challenge presents itself as one of recognizing the need for this consensus to agree on common goals and collective action in the context of a plurality of many ethnic nations, 44 in number, seeking to come together to craft one unitary nation state. Out of many, one. This has been the gospel of Uhuru Kenyatta. This is the vision which Raila Odinga shares in and seeks to build on and carry on. This was the spirit of the Building Bridges initiative, and we reiterate, BBI was much more than a document.
Yes.
The reason the rallying call was from a nation of blood ties to a nation of ideals is because BBI recognized that we have to embrace our ethnicities, but also go beyond them towards higher ideals. It is through this that we will then be able to realize the noble idea of many ethnic nations coming together as a unitary nation state. This is how out of many we can become one. That is the beating heart of Raila Odinga's Azimio la Umoja, Declaration of Unity.
Yeah.
Aristotle asserted that a unified city-state or nation-state in our case is necessary for people to have a good life. This is why President Moi won that siasa mbaya, maisha mbaya.
Yes.
Azimio la Umoja is the spirit of our times, what our forefathers began and what the present generation must now secure. It is a necessary next step in our existential journey as a nation, as AX has pointed out. As I conclude, we submit to you an insight which Professor Mutai Ngunyi has shared with his students, that Uhuru Kenyatta has, in an unprecedented way, laid the necessary foundations for our country's economic takeoff, for our economic transformation. The fruits will be partaken for several generations hence. What is, however, now needed is someone to secure a political transformation.
Yes.
We need a Mandela.
Yes.
And that man is Raila Odinga.
Speak,
And he is the person to do it because the political transformation project is a project which Raila began, and he must now finish that long walk to freedom. And when he's finished, he can then tell us, day, it is finished.
Ooh, you took us to church, CS. This is incredible.
Now, we have a three-part criteria that we use to judge the headlines. We ask ourselves three questions. Are the headlines topical or speculative, repetitive or groundbreaking, thoughtful or just plain lazy?
Yes.
So who are we giving it to? Daily Nation, Magoha and CBC, Standard, fuel prices, Star, speculating on running mates for Raila and RUTO, or People Daily. RUTO's allies feel the heat of BBI collapse, which I am partial to.
So before I give my opinion on what should be the winning headline, I would like to give the Daily Nation and the Standard a bit of a lesson. To paraphrase George Orwell, though all stories are important, some stories are more important than others. And the stories that you covered today were not important if you look at the Star and what the People Daily were able to do. So you cannot say, oh, the political climate is lifeless and there are no, there are stories, you're just not reporting them. Having said that, the Standard and the Nation should be thrown out into the fire.
Do we agree?
Keep me warm, it's
Okay.
cold, yeah.
We toss them out?
Toss them out. For me,
thank
the
you.
People Daily kind of, it actually spoke to my heart today, especially the use of the word collapse.
Yeah.
It really, really inspired me to really see what is happening, especially with the Hustler Nation.
Yes, and I love how it also seems to be holding RUTO to account. Yeah.
I agree. And there we have it. We toss out the Star as well. And we have a winning headline from the People Daily. So, what is our final thought for today?
And now, our final thought, inspired by the book Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism by Naomi Klein.
Yes. So as you know, this week we are looking at information and communication. Yesterday we looked at Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. And today we are talking about an increasingly relevant and perceptive book, The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. In The Shock Doctrine, Klein exposes how capitalism thrives on disaster. And writing in 2007, Klein had many disasters to choose from the Iraq War in 2003 and the preceding invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, to a tsunami in Sri Lanka in 2004, and Hurricane Katrina in the US in 2005. All these disasters are bound together not just by unimaginable suffering and loss, but by the socioeconomic re-engineering that occurred thereafter. Specifically, Klein argues that the shock and disorganization that these disasters wrought created the perfect conditions to restructure society to the benefit of those with money. For example, a tsunami sweeps across Asia and developers take the chance to clear fishing communities off the coasts and build luxury hotels. Or Hurricane Katrina devastates Louisiana in the US, and well-connected corporations turn body retrieval into a money-making enterprise. Or how a global public health crisis provided big tech with the opportunity to gain access to trillions of dollars worth of data. This is the shock doctrine in action. This strategy has been a silent partner to the diplomacy of developed nations for decades, starting in the 1970s in Latin America and extending to our present pandemic-riddled present. According to Klein, the shock doctrine follows a clear pattern. First, the capital holding class must wait for a crisis or even in some instances manufacture one. For example, the United States government has failed to invest in its infrastructure, and this failure will either cause future crises like the week-long blackout in Texas, or exacerbate future crises like Hurricane Sandy in 2012. The second step is to use the hysteria and confusion of the crisis to suspend democratic norms and ram the corporate wish list through as quickly as possible. The reason why the strategy is so effective is because, and according to Klein, extreme violence has a way of preventing us from seeing the interests it serves, end quote. Now, as you were listening, and I know you guys are very smart, I'm sure you were putting two and two together. Right now, the entire world is in a crisis. Right now, democratic liberties have been curtailed in the name of public safety. The conditions for the shock doctrine are all here. And we already know that big tech has seized upon them. And by big tech, of course, I mean Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, what have you. But they are not the only ones. Who else will seize this opportunity? And perhaps the better question is, who already has?
Quite powerful. Now, allow me to pick up from there. Naomi Klein's shock doctrine is a Fort Hall and Fifth Estate favorite. It is also a personal favorite. I rank it right up there with Noam Chomsky's How the World Works.
Great book.
Shock doctrine is also written like a collection of essays, but which are all centered around the common theme of the rise of disaster capitalism. The essays explore the various ways those in positions of power, broadly construed, will not hesitate to visit devastation and destruction if that is the price of turning an immoral profit or advancing an agenda that means that someone has to suffer in an inhumane and undignified way so that someone else can gain. Analyzing this book is both timely and opportune.
Yes.
We say so because there's a chapter which affords unique insight into Matakoju economics. The chapter is in part 3 of the book titled Surviving Democracy, Bombs Made of Laws. It is essentially about how the law and economic ideas can result in repression in otherwise democratic states. Chapter 7 specifically focuses on how economic warfare replaces dictatorship. Naomi Klein takes the time to expose how dangerous economic experiments have devastated nations, and she delves into giving us an example of what happened in Bolivia in the mid-80s. Naomi Klein writes incisively about an extreme form of the Chicago School of Economics that was applied in Bolivia that was essentially economic shock therapy. Much like bottoms-up economics, it abandoned the accepted variations of classical and Keynesian economics. Economic shock therapy opted for radical and novel but difficult to define models which were full of contradictions in order to achieve very narrow aims, but at the risk of putting the entire economy in jeopardy. Radical economic institutional change which achieves repression in otherwise democratic states. So for example, in Bolivia, the economic shock therapy resulted in thousands of full-time jobs with pensions and benefits being eliminated and replaced with precarious ones with no protections at all. If that sounds familiar, that is wheelbarrownomics. That is bottoms up. That is hustlers versus dynasties. Promising to solve unemployment through revolution. Shock doctrine economics, where one section of society is made to suffer in order for another to gain. It is the same toxic rationale of ethnic and political violence. The point is, the example of Bolivia demonstrated that economic shock therapy would inevitably be accompanied by shocking attacks on inconvenient social groups and democratic institutions. I propose that it is precisely why the citizen participation and proportional representation models under BBI are so inconvenient to William RUTO, because they would decentralize power further and inhibit his ability to conduct radical economic shock therapy. We conclude this submission on my part with a quote from the end of chapter 7. Bolivia provided a blueprint for a new, more palatable kind of authoritarianism, a civilian coup d'etat, one carried out by politicians and economists in business suits rather than soldiers in military uniforms, all unfolding within the official shell of a democratic regime.
Oh man, today you're on fire. To me, this is very, very interesting because when you talk about the shock doctrine, it reminds me of one of the 48 laws of power, which says that if you want to catch fish, stir the water. And now, if I was the big tech businesses like AX you're talking about, I would stir a fire. And this takes me to the torture lab, a chapter or part of chapter 1 in this book. And when we talk of disaster, maybe in our minds, all we are thinking about is about maybe economic depression, things like storm, the things we're talking about in the US, COVID-19 or some of those naturally occurring ones. But what about manufactured disaster, like also the one you talk about in your introduction? And the question here is, if disasters can be manufactured, who would benefit and how? In this chapter 1 of this book, Naomi Klein talks about the torture lab. She narrates of the ordeal of a woman by the name of Gail Kastner, who was suffering massive memory issues and paralysis at her old age. In this part, Klein also introduces an accomplished psychiatrist called Ewen Cameron. In the 1950s, the CIA had funded this Cameron to perform a bizarre experiment on his psychiatric patients. He had to keep them asleep and in isolation for weeks, then administering huge doses of electroshock as well as experimental drug cocktails. Cameron at that time was the director at Allen's Memorial Institute. He had rejected the standard Freudian approach of using talk therapy, or what we call counseling here in Kenya, to try to uncover the root causes of his patients' mental illnesses. His ambition was not to mend or repair his patients, but to recreate them using a method he invented called the psychic driving. The first step to psychic driving was depatterning, so like removing the patterns. The aim here was to format, like we used to, the formatting we do on USB disk and whatever, to format the mind to what Aristotle called tabula rasa, or a clean slate. Cameron believed he could reach that state by attacking the brain with everything known to interfere with its normal functioning all at once. Like pro-war hawks who call for the bombing of countries back to Stone Age. Cameron saw shock therapy as a means to blast his patients back to their infancy. Imagine going back to being a baby or being regressed completely. And if frustrated that his patients still seemed to be clinging to remnants of their old personalities, he further disoriented them using uppers, downers, and hallucinogens such as insulin. Once complete depatterning had been, or rather, once complete depatterning had been achieved, an earlier personality had been wiped out completely, then psychic driving or rather started happening. It consisted of playing the patients some tape-recorded messages such as, "You're a good mother, and you're a good wife, and people enjoy your company." And these messages would be repeated 16 to 20 hours each day for many weeks.
Oy.
Actually, in an extreme case, it was repeated for around 101 days. This kind of torture was what Gail Kastner had been subjected to. In her early days, she used to suffer from mental instability, and her family disowned her. She ended up becoming one of the Cameron's victims, but unfortunately, she only learnt of it in 1992, which was years after Cameron had died, and other patients had been compensated by the CIA and the Canadian government, which also participated in funding for the experiments. Therefore, in conclusion of this chapter, or how I understood it, the feeling of erasing past history was equated to the creation of Eve in the Bible. Because she was made from a man's rib, she had no history or any past to remember. And therefore, to manufacturers of disasters, just to answer the question of who benefits and how, those that manufacture disaster through torture, it serves their purpose, whether financially or through experiment. Maybe those big tech companies are doing this to us just to end up benefiting financially. But to victims like Gail Kastner and us, say we are victims of COVID-19, this newness through torture represents an irreplaceable loss.
Indeed.
Poor Gail.
And I hope that demonstrates how broad shock doctrine is and the varied ways in which it can be applied. So on a day when we had a winning headline from the People Daily and no winning cartoon, we'll leave you with a quote that was inspired by today's book, and it is from Chairman Mao, who posited that chaos is a ladder. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are also on your TV screens. Find us on Pang Free to Air, GoTV, and Star Times, and on Twitter on the Fifth Estate. And you can also follow us on our individual handles.